Hello, my name is Emma Snape, Special Event and Program Manager for the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. On behalf of everyone at the museum, welcome to our virtual program, Virtual Gallery Talk, Justices Ginsburg and Scalia's Unlikely Friendship, with civil rights attorney Ashlie Case Sletvold. This program was inspired by our newest special exhibition, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, presented locally by PNC Bank. I'd like to thank PNC and all of our sponsors and partners who help make it possible to bring a first-of-its-kind exhibition like this one to Cleveland. The exhibition, Notorious RBG, is open now, and we're welcoming visitors to join us safely in person, Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We're using best practice protocols such as contactless ticketed timing, I'm so sorry, wearing masks and maintaining social distancing to ensure a safe visiting experience. And of course, we also welcome you to explore the Notorious RBG from the comfort of home. On the first and third Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m., we offer a virtual online tour of the exhibition, or you can bring a group with you for a private online experience. You can learn more about ways to connect through our website, www.maltzmuseum.org. And as a brief bit of housekeeping, if you're here for continuing legal education, please make sure that you're connected to the call with your video on so you can see Ashlie speaking rather than just being on the phone. And please make sure to complete the brief CLE survey that will be sent out to you later today or tomorrow morning. Thank you all for joining us today for our first ever virtual gallery talk. Today, civil rights attorney Ashlie Case Sletvold will be speaking about a few objects from our Visiting Notorious RBG exhibition that speak to the famous relationship between the late Supreme Court Justices Ginsburg and Scalia. Ashlie Case Sletvold is a civil rights attorney who represents plaintiffs in constitutional, employment, and other complex civil matters. She's a partner at Pfeffer, Wolf, Carr, Kane, and Conway, LLP, and president of the William K. Thomas American Inn of Court. A native of Austintown, Ohio, she earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Akron and her JD at the Yale Law School. And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Thank you to Will Pierce for providing our technical support today. And thank you to David Schaefer, Dahlia Fisher, and the Maltz Museum for inviting me to participate in this virtual gallery talk. I am thrilled to take part in the Notorious RBG exhibit to discuss the friendship of these two best buddies, as Justice Ginsburg described them. Welcome. I'm thrilled you're able to be here with us today. We will start by looking back at the personal and professional history of these two intellectual and cultural giants, comparing their paths to the court. We'll talk about some of their disagreements, as well as some of the things they shared in common. We'll also talk about the American Inn of Courts movement and how the Justices Connection has inspired a project through our William K. Thomas Inn to encourage lawyers to connect with adversaries from their past practice in the hopes of building a more collegial and professional practice moving forward. I encourage you to submit your questions through the chat or the Q&A as we go along. I have 3 small children and I'm used to working with interruptions. And I apologize in advance if any of them come in here in some state of undress during the program. The work from home struggle is real. So let's look first at some baby pictures. Baby pictures are always good. So we have here on the left, the Notorious RBG, looking adorably notorious there. RBG was born March 15th, 1933 in Brooklyn, New York, and Justice Scalia on the right was born March 11th, 1936 in Trenton, New Jersey. He moved as a toddler to Queens, New York, where he grew up. He was an only child. Justice Ginsburg had an older sister, Marilyn, who died when she was 1. Ruth had no memory of her sister, but did carry a nickname Marilyn had given her, Kiki, for being a Kiki baby through much of her formative years. So both Justices Ginsburg and Scalia grew up as the only child in their households. Their parents had some similarities as well. Both of their fathers were immigrants to the United States. Nathan Bader immigrated from the Ukraine, and Celia Amster was born in the US to Jewish parents from what is now Krakow, Poland. The Bader family were not devout, but did attend the East Midwood Jewish Center. Salvatore Scalia was an Italian immigrant from Sicily. His wife, Catherine Pinaro Scalia, was born in New Jersey to Italian immigrant parents, and the Scalias were devout Roman Catholics. When Justice Scalia attended a Jesuit military school for high school. Both Justices Ginsburg and Scalia had very impressive educational backgrounds, attending in a number of Ivy League schools. Justice Ginsburg's mother had died of cervical cancer just before she graduated from high school. And her mom had saved for years to ensure that her daughter would have the resources to attend college. Celia's hopes for furthering her own education were curtailed because the family's funds were devoted to educating her brother. So she made sure that the same thing wouldn't happen to her little girl. Now, after college, Ruth enrolled at Harvard Law School, where she was one of only 9 women in a class of 500. Her husband, Marty Ginsburg, who she had met at Cornell, was a second-year student when Ruth began Harvard as a 1L. After Marty had graduated and gotten a job in New York, Ruth transferred to Columbia to finish her 3rd year of law school. So even though Justices Ginsburg and Scalia shared 1 year at Harvard Law, they did not apparently meet during that time, during the 57-58 term. Now, by all accounts, both justices had very happy marriages. The Ginsburgs were married in 1954. The Scalias, Maureen was Justice Scalia's wife. They were married in 1960. Justice Ginsburg famously reported that her mother-in-law gave her some sage advice on her wedding day, which was, in every good marriage, it helps sometimes to be a little deaf. And the justice reported applying this wisdom not only to marriage, but to each of her workplaces, including the Supreme Court. And she reasoned that, quote, reacting in anger or annoyance will not advance one's ability to persuade, which we'll come back to a little bit later as far as that theory goes. Now, both couples had children. The Ginsburgs had 2 children, and the Scalias had 9. So a very large family for the Scalias. And that was, another piece that they shared in common was being working parents throughout the course of their careers. Now, before they were on the bench, both Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, or Attorney Ginsburg and Attorney Scalia, had impressive careers. Justice Ginsburg was a law clerk on the Southern District of New York. And then she was primarily in the professorial space in academia, and also at the same time, beginning in 1972, founded and led the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, which was fundamental in changing the way that American society treated women. Justice Scalia began his career right here in Cleveland at Jones Day in private practice before moving into academia. He had several roles in the federal government before returning to the before beginning at the University of Chicago Law School, which is where he was when he was appointed to the DC Circuit. Now, before the justices ascended to the bench, they both appeared before the Supreme Court. In Justice Scalia had one matter where he participated in an oral argument, and Justice Scalia had 6. So Attorney Ginsburg argued 6 cases before the Supreme Court as part of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. She lost only 1, the Kahn case. Attorney Scalia had 1 oral argument while he was working for the Justice Department in the Office of Legal Counsel. It was a dispute over payments for importing Cuban cigars before the embargo. He appeared on behalf of the U.S. government as a friend of the court, or an amicus curiae, and his side did prevail. So he also had some success at the court where both would eventually sit. The Cuban expats were held to be entitled to the payments for the cigars that had been imported to the U.S. before the embargo. Now, when both justices were first judges, their friendship began on the DC Circuit. Judge Ginsburg was appointed by President Carter in 1980, and Judge Scalia was appointed by President Reagan in 1982. This is when they first met and became close. So close, in fact, that their families began spending New Year's Eves together. Now, think about the people that you spend New Year's Eve with. For me, these are some of my best and closest companions. Though I'm not sure I'm close enough with any of my friends to let them bring their 9 kids over to my house, but I digress. So they overlapped for 4 years on the DC Circuit. Justice Scalia ascended to the Supreme Court in 1986, and then 7 years later, Justice Ginsburg joined him. Now, when they were both appointed to the Supreme Court, I wanted to take a minute and talk about their Senate confirmation votes, because this is, I find it to be remarkable, particularly given the last few rounds of nomination fights that we've seen play out in this country. 98-0 and 96-3 were their confirmation votes, which is unheard of in this day and age. And so I wanted to see what the composition of the Senate was at that time, to see if it somehow could shed some light on why there was so much agreement over what would eventually become fairly polarizing figures from an ideological standpoint. For Justice Scalia's confirmation in 1986, the Republicans held the Senate majority 53-47. For Justice Ginsburg's confirmation, Democrats held the Senate 56-44. So at that time, the filibuster was still available for use in judicial or in Supreme Court confirmations. Neither side had a filibuster-proof majority. Neither of these votes had to happen if anyone in the minority party had wanted to filibuster these nominees. And I think it's pretty remarkable, not just that the votes were held, but the level of unanimity that we saw. And of the 3 senators who voted against Justice Ginsburg's confirmation, all cited her support for women's reproductive freedom, as the source of their objection. But there were still only 3 who voted against her. By contrast, the last 3 justices confirmed, Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, were confirmed by majorities of 54, 50, and 52. That means that no 2 of them got more votes combined than either Justice Ginsburg or Justice Scalia. Does that say more about the quality of the nominees or the deep divisions in our politics? I think I'm going to punt and say both on that. But I just found that to be so remarkable. And I love these photos as well. Justice Scalia did smoke a pipe through the entirety of his Senate confirmation hearing. And I just love the RBG Popeye pose there with the fists going through the confirmation hearing. So their friendship continued as they served on the court together. And the first, this next photo that you're looking at here, this is a photo from the exhibition. This photo was taken in 1994 on the justices' trip with their spouses to Agra, India. It's become a quite famous photo of them riding an elephant together as they traveled in that country. This is one of the items that you'll see if you're able to visit the exhibition. And next is a costume. You'll see a costume. Can we play that video so that they can see it around? There we go. This is a costume that Justice Ginsburg wore when appearing as a supernumerary at an opera show. This is a featured part for a non-singer in the production. In the panel on the bottom photo, these are also photos from the exhibition. You'll see her in that gown at the opera, and above that you'll see her and Justice Scalia appearing together as supernumeraries in a different opera. So you'll see she's with the fan in the white gown and the white wig, and Justice Scalia is to her left, our right, in the blue sort of cummerbund. Opera was a space where they shared a great deal of joy. They shared a mutual love, and were both very devoted to this art form. They, in addition to appearing in operas together, they also attended the Washington National Opera a great deal in DC. And their mutual love of opera was so well known that it inspired a law student composer to write an opera about them. So this is I'm going to play a clip from Derek Wang's opera.
Scalia Ginsburg is an opera based on and inspired by the writings and statements of Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia.
They're ideological opposites, but the warmest of friends.
She's such an interesting, iconic figure. I hope I do her justice.
Nicely done. I see what you did there. On opening night, the stage at the Castleton Festival in Virginia transformed into the Supreme Court.
The justices are blind.
In the opera, Justice Scalia is imprisoned for excessive dissenting. His trusted colleague breaks in to rescue him.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
It's not the first time I've had to break through a ceiling.
They disagree on constitutional interpretation.
Flexible, just another word for liberal.
But in the opera, at least, friendship wins out. After watching the premiere, the Notorious RBG had an early review.
I was in tears.
What's the secret of your friendship?
He has a wonderful sense of humor. The song that they sang tonight, We Are Different, We Are One, I think that captures it.
We are different.
We each understand the way the other thinks.
We are one.
Now, the opera's lyrics, if you read them, as a law nerd like I am, they're nothing short of genius. They are inspired by the different ways that the justices approached interpreting the Constitution. Justice Scalia took an originalist or textualist view, focusing on the only the words in the text of a statute or the Constitution for guidance on how to rule on a question. Justice Ginsburg, by contrast, believed in a living Constitution, one that expanded to cover more than just the white men who were initially considered part of we the people. And they became, over their time on the court together, the sort of bookends of that debate, that intellectual debate among lawyers about how we are to decide how we're going to be ruled. When Justice Scalia died unexpectedly in 2016, his dear friend Ruth gave a moving eulogy at his memorial service. And in this excerpt that we've taken from her full eulogy, she gives us a little insight into their connection.
I once asked how we could be friends given our disagreement on lots of things. Justice Scalia answered, I attack ideas. I don't attack people. Some very good people have some very bad ideas. And if you can't separate the two, you've got to get another day job. You don't want to be a judge, at least not a judge on a multi-member panel. Well-known illustration. Justice Scalia was very fond of Justice Brennan, as Justice Brennan was of Justice Scalia. I will miss the challenges and the laughter he provoked, his pungent, eminently quotable opinions, so clearly stated that his words never slipped from the reader's grasp. The roses he brought me on my birthday, the chance to appear with him once more as supernumeraries at the opera. In his preface to the libretto of the opera buffo, Scalia Ginsburg, Justice Scalia described as the peak of his days in DC, an evening in 2009 at the Opera Ball at the British ambassador's residence, when he joined two Washington National Opera tenors at the piano for a medley of songs. He called it the famous Three Tenors performance. He was indeed a magnificent performer. How blessed I was to have a working colleague and dear friend of such captivating brilliance, high spirits, and quick wit. In the words of a duet for tenor Scalia and soprano Ginsburg, we were different, yes, in our interpretation of written text, yet one in our reverence for the court and its place in the U.S. system of governance.
So in that context of warmth and love that Justice Ginsburg clearly had for Justice Scalia, I want to sort of move into some of the spaces that they most publicly disagreed through their written opinions. These are some a fully non-exhaustive list of the spaces where they found themselves on different sides of constitutional issues affecting our nation at the highest levels. In Bush versus Gore, famously ended the 2000 Florida recount and decided the presidential election. This was expedited briefing. Things happened over a weekend. That was a hodgepodge of separate concurring and dissenting opinions. Justices Scalia and Ginsburg obviously came down on opposite sides of that 5-4 decision. And it is customary in dissenting opinions for justices to conclude with, "I respectfully dissent." Justice Ginsburg famously omitted the respectfully from her dissent in the Bush versus Gore case. In terms of gay rights, at the start of the 1993 movie, The Pelican Brief, which is based on the John Grisham novel, Julia Roberts' character, Darby Shaw, is questioned by her law professor about the Supreme Court's decision in Bowers versus Hardwick, which had upheld state sodomy laws. And asked why the court would uphold such a restriction, Ms. Shaw declared, "They're wrong." And a decade later, the Supreme Court agreed, overturning Bowers in Lawrence versus Texas in 2003. Justice Scalia dissented vociferously in Lawrence and in each subsequent case that recognized greater protections for LGBTQ Americans. By contrast, Justice Ginsburg was the first justice to preside over a same-sex wedding. In 2013, in the US v. Windsor case, which struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, Justice Scalia dissented from the majority opinion. Windsor gave Edith Windsor the right to inherit her wife's estate under the same federal tax treatment as if she'd had a husband. Justice Ginsburg joined in the majority opinion, and in Justice Scalia's dissent, he called the majority opinion legalistic argle-bargle, which was a classic kind of Justice Scalia zinger. He certainly had a way with words. And then finally, in terms of gay rights in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, this was the case that guaranteed marriage equality for LGBTQ Americans. Justices Ginsburg and Scalia were also on opposite sides. In terms of voting rights, in the Shelby County case in 2013 that struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which required DOJ approval for all changes to voting procedures in states with histories of racial discrimination in voting. This essentially required Southern states to get Justice Department permission before changing voting laws in their states. Justice Scalia sided with the majority, striking down the act and ending the pre-clearance process. He called the act a, quote, racial entitlement. Justice Ginsburg dissented, likening the majority's conclusion that pre-clearance was no longer necessary to, quote, throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And then finally, another one of their prominent disagreements were over women's rights. Justice Scalia argued that there was no constitutional right to an abortion. His wife even worked as an anti-abortion activist promoting crisis pregnancy centers. Justice Ginsburg quite obviously was a proponent of women's reproductive freedoms and argued that restraints on women's rights to make very personal and private and important decisions about when to bear children state restrictions on that violated the Equal Protection Clause. You really couldn't get further apart than these two on this extremely controversial issue. So they had so many differences, fundamental ones. What led these two to spend so much time together? And in preparing for this program, I came across this chart. If you want to jump to the next slide, Will, thanks. So this is an analysis that the New York Times did of the 2014 Supreme Court term, setting up, comparing where the judges or where the justices were in agreement versus not. So looking up across the top, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia were on the same side 70% of the time. And that number surprised me because in part of the nature of the cases that make it to the Supreme Court level, that's 70% of the time that a hotly contested issue, they found themselves on the same side. These are cases that parties invest serious resources and endless time moving through the federal court system or the state court system to get to the Supreme Court of the United States. Reasonable people can disagree about most of the issues that come up before the court, and yet 70% of the time, these two were in agreement. I found these data pretty comforting because perhaps we have more in common than we think. What made Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia so close? What did they share in common? Justice Scalia's son, who's a law professor, has remarked publicly on this. And he's highlighted that they were both New Yorkers, close in age, and obviously in the same profession. They both loved teaching. They'd spent time as professors. They loved music and the opera, travel, and a good meal with friends and family. Justice Scalia's son also noted their status as outsiders in the legal profession. A Jewish woman and an Italian-American Catholic certainly were not prominent or the majority of folks practicing law in the late 50s, early 1960s. Both surely experienced discrimination as a result of their outsider status in that way. And I'd add to that a couple of things. I'd add that they were both only children, and that can be something that people find connection over. They were also both attended the Harvard Law School, even though they didn't know one another. There's still that alumni connection that a lot of people find important. They were also both very charming and good-natured people. And perhaps most fundamentally, they were both brilliant people whose ideas shaped our nation. We want people like this to be working together. We want them challenging one another's ideas, making each other better, so we can all be better. We, the people, are all in this together. And so we cannot expect to keep the republic, in my view, if we stay isolated in echo chambers with only those who agree with us. Part of the genesis of the Ginsburg-Scalia Project was thinking about how to forge connections across the aisle in the legal profession, for the good of all and for the benefit of the system and those who rely on it to seek justice. So I'm going to introduce you now to a professor at Smith College. This is Professor Loretta Ross, and her ideas have also helped inspire this initiative that our Inn of Court is proceeding with. Professor Ross is an iconic Black feminist who has been active in social justice movements since the 1970s. The courses she teaches at Smith College are reproductive justice and white supremacy in the age of Trump, where her curriculum includes calling out the call-out culture. Now, she observes, quite rightly, I think, that call-out culture is toxic and alienating. When you get shouted down for an idea that you share that others may not share. She encourages people in her class to get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations and warns her students when they sign up for the course, that this is not a safe space and they need to be able to handle disagreeing with one another respectfully. And I think she's right. Strong disagreements, are always going to be a part of our nation, and we need to know how to handle it. And Professor Ross's work reminds me of Justice Ginsburg's quote, fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Things that used to be conversations among friends or neighbors or relatives or strangers now devolve into shouting matches in online comment sections. You can never, ever persuade someone that you're shouting at. That's why as a lawyer, I never use all caps in filings. It just looks like you're yelling and people skip right over it. But you will not persuade someone by calling them out. No one thinks that lady who just told me off, she totally had a point. That's not how any of this works. But if your friend shares a perspective with you that's different than yours and does it in a nice way, maybe in a social setting or at least privately, maybe you'll listen. Maybe you won't be convinced, maybe you will, but you'll listen. You'll try and understand the other person's perspective. Even if it's not a friend, even if it's a stranger, people speaking with you like you're a human being and not shouting at you, people are much more likely to listen when it's done nicely. And Professor Ross is working to end the call-out culture and is trying to combat white supremacy and fighting for reproductive justice by calling in those who disagree with her, in the hopes of persuading rather than pummeling the other side with contrary views. Now, like the justices, we must be able to disagree and maintain a relationship. I think it's important to remember that the marketplace of ideas doesn't always have to be at the max volume. We can have these conversations as colleagues, as fellow citizens, and we can do it in a way that's productive rather than in a way that's damaging to relationships. So that brings us to the Ginsburg-Scalia Project and some more of the genesis of this. So thinking about Justices Ginsburg and Scalia through the lens of calling out rather than calling, or of calling in rather than calling out, and in the wake of Justice Ginsburg's death in September, I wanted to do something to honor their connection and their very meaningful modeling of a positive relationship, a warm relationship, despite serious differences. So this is the genesis of the Ginsburg-Scalia Project. Now, by way of background, the American Inns of Court movement began in the mid-1980s and was driven by then Chief Justice Warren Burger. And the point of the movement is to increase the professionalism, collegiality, civility, and excellence of the bench and bar. It comes from the 4 Inns of Court in England, which are an integral part of legal education in that country. Lawyers essentially graduate from college with a law concentration in England and then join an Inn of Court for what is essentially an apprenticeship program. They don't have law school like we do here. So the William K. Thomas American Inn of Court was founded in 1989 by local legends and luminaries, including Marv Karp, Judge Richard Marcus, Fred Kramer, Judge Burt Griffin, Professor Steve Werber, and it's named for Judge William K. Thomas, who was a United States District Court judge here in the Northern District of Ohio, who was the epitome of kindness and decency on the bench. I am so honored to carry on their legacy as the Inn's president, and I'm so proud that our members have embraced the Ginsburg-Scalia Project. Now, as a good lawyer, I cite to all sources. So in addition to Professor Ross's work, this project was also inspired by 2 other items. First, a conversation I had with Judge Peggy Foley Jones back in the summer about the deep animosity and difficult personalities that can infect the litigation process and make life miserable for litigators. I'd be lying if I didn't say there wasn't more than one time where, you just step away from your computer and you're just frustrated at the amount of wasted time that's going into the petty gripes between lawyers. And second, also inspiring the project is an order that I've been carrying around from one job to another throughout my career. It's a trial court order from Arizona, from the Phoenix area. So this is an order, this is a real order, I'm not making this up, the plaintiff's counsel had moved to compel a lunch date with defense counsel, and the court obviously granted this motion. and traces the genesis of the dispute here. If you bounce to the next slide there, Will. Plaintiff's counsel had invited the defendant's counsel to lunch, defendant ignored it, and now the defense counsel is somehow accepting, but not quite, saying he'd love to go to Ruth's Chris. The court then drops a footnote saying everyone knows that Ruth's Chris, while open for dinner, is not open for lunch. This is a matter of which the court may take judicial notice. I always appreciate a judge with a wicked sense of humor. And the entire order is replete with these sorts of just funny asides and things of that nature. But it also includes an order detailing a list of location options. In the order, there's a formula for dividing the cost of the meal, and there's a timeline for compliance. But the court concludes with this. As far as when the attorney should talk about the matters related to the case that the plaintiff's counsel had wanted to discuss over this meal. I find this to be both hilarious and sad. And it gives us as lawyers a glimpse into how we look to courts when we are bickering over our cases. It doesn't give the public much confidence in our judicial system if lawyers don't behave professionally. And the inability to get a lunch date together without court intervention is pretty embarrassing. So too is the need for constant court involvement in what should be standard aspects of case management, like scheduling matters and getting basic discovery done. Courts are likely to view us as children if we look like we're fighting in the sandbox all the time. So I believe that the overall professionalism of the bar and the effectiveness of our justice system would be vastly improved if lawyers behaved more collegially and, like Justices Ginsburg and Scalia, had more meaningful connections to one another. Collegiality is a key aspect of the American Ends of Court movement and why we've initiated the Ginsburg-Scalia Project to encourage more of those connections so we can be more effective in representing our clients. So how does it work? You can hop to the next slide there, Will. So the project is very simple. You reach out to a former opponent and you set a time to have a meeting in a social context, whether it's a lunch date, whether it's happy hour, and you sit down one-on-one. You don't get together to rehash old disputes. You're not trying to convince anybody you were right or they were wrong. Like, that's not what this is about. The focus is on professionalism. Could you have been a better opponent? Is there anything you're doing that makes you less effective? Are you irritating people? Are you making people miserable? Are you living up to your own values of professionalism? Is the way you're perceived consistent with your own values? But even more so than that, the focus is on connection. Get to know this person, this opponent, this adversary, so that next time you are better professionals as you're competing. If you can we can all serve our clients better if we don't get sidetracked with petty disputes, and if we can practice in a collegial and civil way. So much time and money is wasted on unprofessional conduct that has nothing at all to do with the underlying dispute. But rather than calling out our opponents in court filings for not following rules, perhaps we can encourage more professional practice through these kinds of personal connections. I'm going to introduce at this point Adam Freed, who is going to speak. He's a former president and current member of the William K. Thomas Inn of Court, whose practice focuses on estate matters. He was kind enough to film a short video about his experience with the Ginsburg-Scalia Project. So I'm going to play Adam's video, Will.
Good morning, Ashlie. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in the Ginsburg-Scalia Project. I don't think I have to tell you that practicing in an adversarial type of a business doesn't sometimes create adversaries. Even when you are friends with your adversary, sometimes it can be difficult. A friend of mine and I got into a little tiff in a litigated matter, and because of the Ginsburg-Scalia Project, the two of us got together, part of our William K. Thomas American Inn of Court event, and we decided to have a dinner together. And we were able to mend fences, and I think next time we're on a case against each other or with each other, that we will be able to communicate much better for the betterment of our clients. So the project is a really great opportunity to remember that just because you're adversaries in court doesn't mean you have to be adversaries in real life. And I want to thank you again for the opportunity.
I think Adam is really onto something there. It is just hard to be a jerk to your friends. And if we are all, as lawyers, practicing as part of a professional community, where you know the people, you know their spouses, you know their families, you know their struggles, we are all better connected, and we'll be more likely to be on our best behavior more often, and not just when the judge is in the room. This is all about holding ourselves accountable. And I think this has gotten somewhat easier to do during the midst of this pandemic, because we've all sort of had to invite one another into our homes to continue working during the shutdown, during stay-at-home orders. We've had, most days my kids interrupt at least one Zoom call that I'm on. People who would have never seen my kids before are now getting a glimpse into more of me as a person that humanizes us and makes us, see each other as the whole people that we really are, rather than just as adversaries fighting on behalf of our clients. I don't imagine that we're all going to get to the point where we're celebrating New Year's Eve with our adversaries, but each step in that direction, I think, is progress. And so the William K. Thomas American Inn of Court is deeply committed to being part of that solution. And we are thrilled to honor these two legends with this initiative. So with that, I would be glad to take some questions from the group. I see we've got some here. Let me make sure I'm seeing them. Emma, do you want to?
So to start off, I would like to ask, what was your experience the very first time that you reached out to someone as part of the Ginsburg-Scalia Project?
Well, like any good leader, I did the beta testing that I should have before launching it, and reached out to a gentleman that I'd had a fairly contentious matter with a few years ago. We had actually both moved to disqualify one another from the case. So that's pretty high level, lawyer fisticuffs on paper. And it was wonderful. It was a guy, about my age. We both had a previous history of volleyball participation. I was a college volleyball player. He had played at a fairly high level as well. And I just sort of knew from litigating against him that this would be a guy I would be friends with, but for the fact that our clients were at each other's throats, right? So I reached out to him, and bless his heart, he was willing to do it. And that takes a fair amount of trust to be able to think that there's not something nefarious going on. I don't think we as lawyers trust each other very much, but it was lovely. And we did it over, in late September, early October. It was still nice enough to be outside, and we got lunch downtown and kind of, walked a little bit through some of the past matters that we'd been involved in, but mostly just hung out. And now I certainly, looking back, have a much warmer feelings about him than I would have had we not sat down and taken the time to talk. And then I've also reached out to someone in a matter that was never filed, where we reached a resolution. It was a sexual harassment case where the clients were quite furious with one another. And it was pretty heated between the lawyers. We had a confidential mediation and reached a resolution, but it just felt very acrimonious. And so, I reached out to her about doing this. And again, I appreciate the trust that people are willing to put into a former adversary in this regard. I think it speaks very highly of the people who are willing to participate. And that's, that's gives me hope about the profession. But we found that we had some, we'd previously been on the same board. Her board service was a few years before mine. So we found we had many things in common that were separate from being on separate sides of that case. So I've very much enjoyed it and look forward to doing some more of it.
Fantastic. Another question from our audience that kind of digs in that same direction is asking, what was your key motivation in getting involved with the Ginsburg-Scalia Project?
Justice Ginsburg's death is what made me really sort of accelerate what had kind of been brewing in me as an initiative based on the conversation I'd had the summer before with Judge Peggy Foley-Jones, where we're talking about there just has to be some way to make this less miserable for people, like to get people to be nicer to one another as we go through this process. It doesn't have to be so rough. It doesn't have to be so so vicious, and things devolve fairly quickly in some matters. I mean, many matters are fine. They're just sort of, there's nothing particularly terrible about them. I don't mean to give the wrong impression that somehow lawyers are at each other's throats day and night, but it's way more common than it needs to be. And so that was, I'd been planning to develop something along these lines. And then when Justice Ginsburg died, it was, I can't wait any longer. We have to do something to honor her memory. So that was kind of what brought it to a head.
So speaking a little bit to this desire to not want to go down this road of kind of more brutal tactics, somebody in our audience is asking, what do you say to a client that wants these Rambo style tactics and does not want to extend any courtesy to the other side? How do you manage that as a lawyer?
Well, I make clear with my clients when we begin a relationship that I'm a professional. Like, I'm not here to make people's lives difficult. I'm not here to fight with someone and cause them anxiety and harm and interfere with the way that they, with their lives. Like, we have a dispute that needs to be litigated and we're going to litigate it. We're not going to the mattresses. Like, that's not what this is supposed to be like. Law is a profession. And if there's a client who wants me to act like it's not, then that client needs to find another lawyer. I don't find it to be an effective way to practice. I don't think judges like seeing Rambo tactics. And so if a client wants me to be effective for them, they've got to let me do it in the way that I think is best. So I reject that, and I know that can be hard, particularly with, institutional clients or larger organizations. I'm a plaintiff's lawyer, so my clients aren't often, paying me hourly. So I get to sort of set the expectations for how we're going to do this. We're going to do what we need to do to get you to trial so that we can win. Like, that's when that's your objective. I think it's a somewhat of a different analysis, but we take oaths as lawyers. We are the only profession that swears to uphold the Constitution and needs to live by a code of professional conduct. The lawyer's creed, which they hand you when you get sworn into the bar in Ohio and I believe other states, was written by Marv Karp, who was the first president of the William K. Thomas Inn. And it speaks to how you will treat people with respect. You will treat your opponents fairly. You will not refuse to give reasonable requests for extension. You will not be a jerk about scheduling depots. You will not, be obstreperous. You will not interfere. You will not, make improper objections, that sort of thing. And that's just sort of a baseline way of practicing. And even if everybody else isn't reaching that bar, I think it's important on those of us who value professionalism to set it and stay at it and continue to clear it, because just because others are having a mud wrestling match doesn't mean we need to roll up our sleeves and get involved in that.
In that same vein, when working with the Ginsburg-Scalia Project, do you give any guidelines for what proper communication is? We have somebody in our audience asking specifically, do you give any NLP or nonviolent communication guidelines?
I think that with our Inn of Court is an elite lawyer professional association. You have to apply to participate in this. You have to be accepted. You have to be nominated by a member and accepted in. And so I don't think that, I guess it never occurred to me that perhaps we would have to tell our folks how best to communicate. But we've certainly incorporated into our programming for this year. We meet monthly. That as an Inn of Court, we meet monthly. And there's a CLE program presented by a subset of the group. So each year, each member has 1 month that they have to participate and do something. And this year we have really focused on looking at things from different perspectives and trying to situate yourself at a different angle, looking at things maybe not how you would look at them, but how someone who's unlike you or is competing against you, or who has a different set of lived experiences would look at them. And so I think that has really well prepared our members to go out and have these conversations. I mean, one-on-one, when you don't have the keyboard courage, you're not in a situation where you're just lobbing bombs at someone you're sitting speaking to. That's really not, our bodies react in a way that when the tension rises, you've got cortisol release, you've got adrenaline, like it just isn't comfortable to be angry with someone that you're physically in the presence of. And so that is sort of what this is designed to do, is to get people in the same room, get people in proximity to one another so that they can connect as human beings and not as just this faceless, angry fingers on the other side of a keyboard who are, either filing things against me or writing mean comments about me, whatever the context is. It requires you to go into that space as a kind and professional human being, which is what we value and we further in the end through our general programming, as well as through this new initiative. But I'd love to, whomever asked that question, I'd love to see if there's some specific set of principles that you'd recommend that we share with our group. I'd love to see it. That's wonderful.
What you're saying about being in the same room really reminds me of the ritual that I know that the justices had when Ginsburg and Scalia were both on the court, of entering the robing room together and each of them shaking hands with each other as this very intentional act of being at the same table together. And so I want to take this opportunity for the last few minutes of our program to ask you a couple of questions about Ginsburg and Scalia again. But so one of the questions that we have for you is that in the context of their professional work, how did Justices Ginsburg and Scalia learn of the common interests that sparked their friendship? Or did mutual admiration, despite judicial preferences, despite judicial differences, precede their personal friendship? Do you know?
I don't know whether they, if they were sort of set up on a blind date by a colleague in the in the DC circuit. Within any sort of appellate court, judges sit on panels. And so in the DC circuit, the judges would sit on three judge panels, similar to how the Supreme Court always sits as 9 justices. And so there's gonna, pre-COVID times, we were all getting together in a room to hear things and to do work stuff together, which I miss. But I don't know if they, how they came to know of their mutual love of opera. I would hazard a speculation that it was just through being in one another's presence as they conducted the court's business.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit to the process of how justices communicate with each other before the decision is made? Is there any private conversation that goes on, or do justices tend to deliberate on their own and then come together?
The justices do have a meet in conference and discuss the outcome of the case, where they think the case should come down. They sit and discuss with one another, and then once they've taken the vote, either the Chief Justice, if the Chief Justice is in the majority, or the most senior justice, if the Chief Justice is in the dissent, is in the minority, the majority opinion is assigned by either the Chief Justice or the most senior justice in the majority. And so after they've assigned these the opinions, who's going to write the majority opinion? Others may choose to write concurring opinions. Dissents, there may be one dissent or multiple dissents, but drafts of these are circulated amongst the court. So, and not just, the majority is looking at their own. Everyone's looking at everyone else's. You'll see in a lot of opinions that the justices are responding to things that are said in the dissent or vice versa as part of their written opinions. And so that all requires a level of cooperation that and planning, which is nice for lawyers. Nobody's waiting until the last minute. They're circulating their drafts of the opinions. And one of the things that both Justices Ginsburg and Scalia had spoken about their professional work together was that reading the others' critiques of their arguments helped them sharpen and improve their position. So seeing where the other side was coming at your ideas can certainly help, improve you don't want cracks in your argument. As a lawyer, as a judge, you want it to be solid. You want to seal up any cracks. And so that can be something that's very helpful. The justices also communicate with one another through what Justice Ginsburg called Dear Ruth letters, where they write to one another. It's, not the formality of like, Dear Justice Ginsburg, it's Dear Ruth, either here's what if you take this out of your opinion, I'll join it. If you add this to your opinion, I'll join it. Here's what I like or don't like about and sometimes though, like through the drafting process and seeing, kind of it played out and is more thought, as the justices can give more thought to seeing the other sides, sometimes those votes change. And sometimes what was going to be a dissenting opinion becomes the majority opinion. And there's some reshuffling as these very smart people look at what the others are saying and at the fully developed arguments that their colleagues are making. And so the ability to work and give people the ability to persuade you allows you to also persuade them, to have that give and take, to treat one another with respect. Just because we disagree about an issue doesn't mean that we have to hate one another. Just because we have different views of how the Constitution should be interpreted certainly doesn't mean that we should hate one another. And I don't think that you're ever going to persuade, as I said before, you're never going to persuade somebody that you're shouting at or that you're treating as if, you think they're less than dirt because they don't share some view that you have. And that goes for people with whatever set of ideas, whether it's a conservative or progressive view. You're never going to persuade anybody by shouting them down. So that the way that the justices valued professionalism and collegiality, and still do, but particularly Justices Ginsburg and Scalia, I don't think they were the only two that had close relationships. I've also read that Justice Scalia taught Justice Kagan how to hunt, and that takes a lot. Someone who's typically seen publicly as your adversary, you're going to teach them how to use a firearm. Like that's some professional love right there. That's the kind of world that I want to live in, where we can all, agree that what we have the most respect for is the rule of law and a functioning system of justice, and avoid all of the, sort of partisan bickering as we go about figuring out how best to do this together.
Thank you so much. And then for one very last question to close this out, because it's almost 1 o'clock, we've got to let people go. But when you look to the Supreme Court today in 2021, do you see any examples of the kind of bipartisan friendship that inspired the Ginsburg-Scalia Project?
I certainly don't see anything like those two and their connection on the court today. I hope that as the years pass and the new justices can be integrated into that. I mean, goodness, for the last year plus, they're really not spending a whole lot of time together. I understand they've been doing arguments remotely. That does in some ways make it so much more difficult to develop those connections when we're all sitting looking at a Zoom screen. But I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to see these kinds of very important modeling behaviors. Like, it shouldn't strike us as mystifying that two brilliant people who are at the tops of their professions can have a lot in common and are friends. Like, that shouldn't seem so jarring or strange to us. I think we can do so much better as we try and create the kind of world that we want to live in.
Thank you. What a fantastic thought to close on. So Ashlie, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I really appreciated everything that you taught us today and everything I learned from you. I'd also like to thank everybody at home for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions in the Q&A. You can join us again next month for May's virtual gallery talk program, when fashion historian Dr. Einav Rabinovich-Fox will join us to discuss RBG's famous jabot, robe, and scrunchie, and how she used fashion to make a statement. You can find more info on this program and others by visiting www.maltzmuseum.org. Thank you again, Ashlie, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us.